Hello everyone, welcome to Computer Science E7. This is lecture 4, Exposure Continued. So if you'll notice, we passed out assignment 2 today. You can find the PDF online, or if you have a copy here, you can also read through it if you would like. And assignment 1 was due today about 6.5 minutes ago or so. So hopefully you've gotten those in on time. And so this assignment builds upon the last one in that it's a little bit less introductory, and we're getting into a bit more of the more interesting material now. So whereas before it was really like say hello, introduce yourself, show us what your photographs are. Now it's more like, okay, here's the stuff that we're really getting into, and so welcome to Computer Science E7. And so it's saying that to you in very much a in a way that you will hopefully appreciate very soon. It's not to say that this assignment, of course, is impossible or even all that difficult. It's just that paying attention to the material that we go over in lectures will help you certainly get through, especially the first part, which is somewhat theory-based and will help you appreciate some of these technical aspects that we've been putting so much emphasis on throughout the semester. And so this assignment has 3 parts. The first part is a problem set like portion, which, as I said, is somewhat theoretical in that it has some questions that are maybe a little bit math-like, or at least going over some of the more theory that we've been talking about the last few lectures, and we'll continue talking about in the upcoming lectures. Then part 2 asks you to take 10 photos, and realize that we don't expect you to take 10 photos, we expect you to take many, many photos and pick 10 from those photos that you take, and they should be, very good photographs. And there's a number of requirements that you must meet in order to receive full credit on those photos. Yes.
Are you allowed to edit any of your photos?
I'm sorry?
Are you allowed to edit any of your photos?
No, not yet. No editing of any photos, please. So just pretty much when you take a photo, that's how we want it. It's sort of the raw photo, not a raw file, that is, not something in a raw format that came out of your camera, but sort of the raw photo that you just took and uploaded to Flickr. You can, if you need to, resize the image so that you can meet any Flickr upload requirements or anything like that, but just keep in mind that you should maintain that metadata. Remember in the software lecture we talked about how all of these files have additional pieces of information embedded within them that tells us some information about how the photograph was taken, when it was taken, so on and so forth. You want to be sure that that data is preserved. Image editors like Photoshop and even some, and definitely some free ones can maintain that metadata, but if you have any questions on that, do feel free to email us. And then part 3 is actually a continuation of part 2, where maybe you're getting stuck on some particular image in part 2 and you want to get some feedback on it. That's the entire point of the third part of this assignment. You will upload one photo that you're having trouble with to your Flickr account, add it to a thread in the discussion board. You'll create your own thread and basically just ask people, what do you think? What could be improved? Or even ask a specific question and say, I'm having trouble with the lighting in this particular situation, or I can't quite get all of these objects in focus that I want to, or something like that. You could ask for some tips and tricks to try to help get you through that portion of the part. And so if you have any questions on this assignment, of course, you can feel free to send us an email. So recently we've been going over a lot of the exposure values that are dealing with your camera. So we've talked about pretty much the 4 major components that determine the exposure on your camera. And so I've given you the answer here for one of them, but what are the other 3, if you remember? So shutter speed is 1. We also have aperture, or f number, and the third one is, and there's even a 4th one that's sort of sneaky that you can't actually control on your camera per se, but that would be, the amount of available light. That is perhaps the biggest dictator of what all of these various settings can actually be set to. And so as we talked about, all of these things come in versions of stops. So one stop difference is basically having or doubling the amount of available light that you have when exposing a particular image. But realize that cameras don't usually operate strictly in one-stop increments. Sometimes they'll operate in half-stop or even third-stop increments. So for example, let's say we were working with the shutter speed of 1 well, this is a very good example because it says 1/1250th of a second, and that's about a third of a way from the next lower shutter speed, which would be 1/1000th of a second, and it goes on from there. So whereas before we were talking about stop increments in terms of, okay, well, 1/500th of a second is one stop away from 1/1000th of a second, realize that many cameras have additional increments in the middle there. So you might also have something like 1/700th and 1/850th or something like that, additional, so two additional increments within the stop. And so, of course, those aren't additional stops that you're getting for free. It's just additional level of control or finer grained control over the exposure values that you have. And so it may seem a little bit crazy to have that sort of that fine level of control where you can take you can take a photo with a difference of 250,000th of a second or something like that. But it really does become important when you are factoring in all of these other different types of exposure values into your image. And if you remember, we use shutter speed to try to freeze motion so that we could get either an action shot for, say, sports, or we could have a longer exposure time to introduce motion blur into the image. So if we wanted to get a little bit of artistic blur, then we could do it with a long shutter speed. And all this time I've been touting the use of a tripod to stabilize your camera to make sure that when you are using a very long shutter speed, it remains absolutely still so that you can have the shutter open for a second or 2 seconds or minutes or hours, and still it will remain relatively still so that only the objects that are moving within the image will appear to have motion blur. And there is actually an additional feature that some cameras, or rather some SLR cameras have, that can help you control motion blur a little bit more. And so if you flip through your SLR's manual, you may find this reference to a mirror lockup, or an MLU is as it's sometimes abbreviated. And if you remember from the way that SLRs work, and this is really only applicable to SLRs because compact digital cameras, as you'll understand in a moment, don't actually have this problem. But in SLRs, what happens when you take a photo is that there is the mirror inside, of course, that flips up and out of the way for the shutter to actually open and expose the sensor behind it. Now, this mirror has, non-zero mass. That is, it has some amount of weight to it. And so when it moves up and it hits the pentaprism up top, so there's actually a box that it hits at the top that keeps it from moving anymore, that can actually cause very, very slight vibrations in your camera that you would never actually notice or perceive individually, but at certain shutter speeds, even if it's on a tripod, you will notice a certain amount of motion blur within your images. And that's because this could drive you crazy. And in fact, if you're new to SLRs and you've used compact digital cameras even on tripods and have gotten very pristine, very crisp images without needing to use this feature, it could be a bit of a surprise when you use an SLR for the first time and realize that this thing happens. And so the mirror lockup, the whole point of this feature is that it moves the mirror up and out of the way before, or some significant amount of time before you actually take the photo. And on Canons, it's unfortunately difficult to enable. But once you go into the menus and enable it, then let's say I take a photo. You'll notice that the mirror has moved up, but if you're actually able to look inside, you'll notice that the shutter is still closed. So I push the button once, that moves the mirror up and out of the way. Now all those vibrations will sort of soften and dampen over time. And now that those vibrations have gone, I can push the shutter button a second time, and it will actually move the shutter up and take the photo. And then, of course, at the end, it will move the mirror back down. So you can imagine that there's some other reasons why you could get some shakiness or some motion blur into your SLR camera. What I just did, for example, by holding the camera and actually pushing down on the button, that again is putting very minute vibrations into the camera, into this whole system. So even if you use mirror lockup and you're using the shutter button, unless you're very careful, you can introduce some additional vibrations and get a little bit of blurriness in the photo that way. And that's when you realize that, okay, you're going to have to spend a little bit more money and get a remote unless your camera happens to come with one. But these are all sort of advanced things that you don't really need to, of course, to take a photo at all, but to get the absolute best photo that you can, you may realize that these are some techniques or some pieces of equipment that you will actually need to use. So going back to exposure values, we said shutter speed was one of them. The next one was ISO. So we could modify we can think of it as modifying the sensitivity of the sensor. And so if you remember from the film days, we had high ISO film to use it indoors. We had low ISO film to use it outdoors or in bright conditions. And digital cameras, whether they're SLRs or compact cameras, also have this same notion where you can increase or change the sensitivity. And by increasing the sensitivity, you could get back an increase in shutter speed. So you could get a little bit of graininess in your image at the cost of being able to freeze motion a little bit better, or vice versa. If you wanted to introduce a little bit more motion blur, you could potentially get a cleaner image. Because as you remember, the downside to increasing the ISO in pretty much any camera is that you get additional levels of noise or splotchiness, and it depends on how your camera reacts to high ISO images. Sometimes you'll just see little speckles of different colored pixels, whether it be red or blue, or an increase in brightness or a decrease in brightness. But sometimes they're very aggressive in their noise canceling characteristics, and you'll see that they try to smoothen it out a little bit by averaging some of the nearby pixels, and you'll get this sort of splotchiness that exists. Now the last one is aperture, or the F number. And so this was sort of the most difficult of the numbers to comprehend, because unlike sensitivity and shutter speed, where we could very easily double them or halve them in order to figure out what a stop difference was, increasing the aperture by one stop involved some complicated math, where we had to double the area of the lens, which means that we had to square root the diameter, or we had to square the diameter and square root that in the end, and a variety of other things that gave us some confusing numbers. But if you remember, the easy way to remember how to memorize these F numbers is to remember two numbers, F1 and F1.4, and alternatively double them each. So 2 and 2.8, 4, 5.6, so on and so forth, and you'll be able to remember them. Higher numbers mean that it is darker. It's a darker stop. Okay, so hopefully now all of you understand what these three values do, or how they impact your image and how they can make or break your photograph, depending on what you want to achieve within it. But most of you, I'm sure, have been using cameras up until now in some sort of an automatic mode, whether it defined one of these exposure values for you or even all three of them for you. It may not be so clear how the camera was able to determine this. And so no, your slide or my projector or your computer screen at home is not broken. This is intentionally a gray screen. And this is how we can think of a camera is metering a scene. So this is just meant to be a very overgeneralized version of how a camera is able to figure out what the three exposure values should be. So it just looks at the scene and it tries to determine the level of brightness. And so it tries to make that level of brightness of the scene overall a sort of middle gray, this sort of mid-gray, sort of not too dark, not too bright. It's just sort of right in the middle. And the camera will try to adjust the exposure values so that overall the exposure will be for this middle gray. And so so then a camera, if it realizes, if it looks at a scene overall and it has a little metering sensor inside of it that tries to figure this information out, and it says, okay, it looks a little dark to me, what could it do? So let's say it just has some, so let's say that it's set by default to the Sunny 16 rule, which is what? So we're going to go off on a slight tangent here. Sunny 16 rule says what? Yep, ISO 100. 1/100th of a second at f16, but what do those settings, how are they relevant? Yeah, bright sunny day outside. Okay, so let's say that the camera by default is looking at a scene at those particular settings and it thinks that the scene is a little bit dark. So what could the camera do to try to brighten the scene up? I'm sorry? Right, it could open up the aperture, it could make the F number smaller, so it could go down to F11 or F8 or F5.6. What else could it do? Increase the ISO. So 100 is a little low, maybe it could go up to 200, 400, 800, depending on the capabilities of the camera. Last one? Yeah, decrease the shutter speed. So rather than being 1/100th of a second, it could be 1/50th of a second. And now, all of these things the camera takes into account, along with some other parameters that we'll talk about in a moment, to try to figure out exactly what settings it should use when trying to figure out metering. Now, there's actually a difference between incident light and reflected light. So incident light would be something like you're trying to take a picture directly of a light bulb, where that light bulb is glowing and it's a source of light, versus reflected light, which could be something like how you're seeing me right now. All of the light from the room is reflecting off of my clothing and off of my face, and you're seeing the photons that are being reflected. And so the camera doesn't understand the difference between each of this light. And so sometimes there are professional light meters where you may have seen them in especially in stock photos or even behind the scenes videos of movies, for example, where they show these photographers holding this silly looking device in their hand that has a white bulb at the end. You might have seen this and not really understood what it was for, but what it's doing is measuring the incident light, so the amount of light that is within the room and not being reflected off of the person. And then this way, they could either have it memorized or look up in some tables, try to figure out exactly what exposure settings they should use based on the amount of light in the room. Now, arguably, this gives you the best exposure settings to use, because then you can take into account a variety of things. So, for example, if I was wearing a black shirt instead of a red shirt, then you can imagine that this might fool the camera, because if you're taking a picture of primarily my shirt, for example, or a portrait of me, and the shirt is taking up the majority of the photo, the camera might say, okay, well, this looks very dark, so I'll try to make it a little bit brighter. And so this happens because it's recording the reflected light rather than the incident light. And if I had some way of knowing this incident light, or the amount of light that was in the room, then I could very accurately give the camera the proper exposure settings for that room, for pretty much everything in that room, and all of the photos that you take, assuming the light doesn't change, will be accurate. And so you'll realize that even though the incident light is the most accurate way of recording exposure or figuring out exposure values, the cameras that we use just do not have that sort of luxury to do that. And unless you want to spend a lot of money purchasing one of these pieces of hardware, it's going to be difficult for you to do the same. And so instead, we have to go through a number of tricks to try to use the reflected light instead to meter our photos. And so there's a variety of metering modes that your camera has to try to combat these various problems that exist. So just in this one example that I mentioned, I'm wearing a black shirt, and you're taking a portrait of me that's primarily of my shirt. Maybe it's of my upper body, for example. And so the camera then sees, the most of the image is black, is very, very dark, and it will try to increase the exposure values to bring it up to this sort of middle gray. You can imagine that would be a bad thing, because you could overexpose my face. So we have a couple of metering modes that we can use to try to combat this. So one of them, for example, is the spot metering mode. And so some cameras, I'm going to go through a variety of these metering modes, and you should realize that many cameras do support all of these, but some cameras only support some of them, if that makes sense. So whatever you see here, you'll have to look into your camera's manual to see if it actually supports these various metering modes. So here, this is basically a graph, and you can imagine that we have along this X and Y axis of this graph here is that image that you're trying to take a picture of. So it's just the image that you're taking a picture of, sort of angled, and the height of the graph is telling you the importance that the camera is placing within certain regions of the photograph for metering. So in other words, you can see that all of this, the surrounding area here is very, very low. That means that the camera is not going to look at it when determining what exposure should be middle gray, and instead it's only going to be taking the very center spot, hence the name, spot metering, the very center spot when trying to consider exposure settings. So in other words, if you now changed your metering mode to spot metering, and I held up just a gray card, a card that was meant to show you, exactly what's called 18% gray, and some people call it 12% gray, and there's some debate about this, but basically it's called an 18% gray card that's basically this middle gray. If I held this up and you pointed the camera, the center of the viewfinder, at that gray card, and then told the camera to remember those exposure values, then you have basically used spot metering to try to combat this reflected light problem that we have. So by looking at the very center of the image, so if you just pointed it at that gray card, recorded the exposure values, and your camera can do that for you, then you will be able to take a properly exposed photograph without this problem of the camera making the rest of the image too bright because I was wearing a very, very dark shirt. Now, generally, a spot mode is meant to be a very small portion of the image. It's about the center 3% or so of this. And if you're going to use this trick that I mentioned where you are remembering the exposure values, you'll have to look for something called an AE lock or an auto exposure lock on your camera. Some cameras have a dedicated button for it. Other cameras you have to make a button dedicated for it. But you just point it at it, push the AE lock button. That means the exposure settings are locked for that particular scene. Then the scene can move around, and when you take the photo, it takes the photo at those particular exposure settings. Now there's a different one as well, which might have been popular pretty early on, and that was this center-weighted metering mode. So rather than spot, which uses a very small percentage right in the middle of the image to try to figure out the proper exposure settings, center-weighted still uses the center primarily in its calculation of the proper exposure values, but it also it more smoothly falls off towards the edges. So this might work a little bit better if you were just taking a picture of me in my black shirt. It might work a little bit better if you had composed it so that my face was maybe in the top third or so of this image, because then you might see that the camera would realize that there's some brighter portions in this image and may not try to increase the exposure values so much. But there is a problem with this, as you can imagine, and that is that in the very first lecture I told you to stop centering everything in the middle of the frame. And so if you listen to me, then you'll realize that this is not actually going to help you out very much, because then you'll still have to use spot metering and meter on something that's off to the side and then recompose with an AE lock. So this is not really going to be all that helpful. So one of the most recent, and I use recent in relative terms, one of the most recent innovations in this, and what many cameras use, is zone metering. And zone metering can get really complicated really quickly. There's some cameras can have up to 1,000 zones. It'll break up the image into 1,000 different zones and meter each one independently. And every manufacturer has a different way of using zone metering to calculate the exposure values. But let's say that we took this image and broke it into 9 zones. So we have a zone here, a zone here, a zone here. Now what the camera can do is use a variety of information that's given to it to try to figure out how it can meter this scene. So for example, let's say that I had focused on this guy sitting over here. Well, the camera could say, okay, I'm focusing in on this zone over here, so I should place more importance on the exposure of that zone because that's where the subject is, for example. So this is just one way they could do it. So you could use, they could use the AF point, the autofocus point like I just described. It could also try to use the distance to the subject to figure out how much importance to give it. So if the subject is very, very far away, then maybe we have to give a few more zones some importance when it's trying to calculate the exposure. And then let's see, so it could try to also figure out based on the aperture, or the F number rather, what portions of the image are in and out of focus, and then it could maybe ignore those zones, for example. And then let's see, so it could also try to figure out if something is backlit, if there's some regions, if it knows what the subject is, for example, and it knows that it's very, very bright behind the subject, then it could try to figure out to ignore those things, so on and so forth. But as you can see, this is getting to be a very, very complicated algorithm, and no camera manufacturer has it absolutely perfect. And so you will still have a variety of problems that exist through some difficult situations, and you will have to adjust or change your exposure values depending on that particular situation. But anyway, if your camera has a zone metering mode, this is most likely what you will be using because it will generally be the most accurate in general situations, unless you have something very specific in mind, like you're in a studio, for example, with fixed lighting. Then you might want to use spot metering, figure out the exact exposure for that particular setting and remember those values, or use the auto exposure lock so that those settings do not actually change. Center weighted, this is just meant as a, I mean, you can use it, but I don't think it's going to be terribly useful. But also, when we're talking about zone metering, You shouldn't really use the number of zones. You shouldn't really take that into account when deciding to purchase one camera over another. I would argue that metering has gotten pretty good at this point, and no matter what camera you buy, it's going to have some downfalls and it's going to have some advantages over other cameras, and so you'll have to learn your camera and try to figure out how it's going to react.